Hello everybody, I'm going to read a book, and it's this book, Christopher Lachache. The book's called The True and Only Heaven, Progress and Its Critics. So in this book, there's a little chapter here, Brownson's Attack on Philanthropy. To call Brownson a Republican would be stretching a point. He considered it an argument in favour of democracy, that it takes care not to lose the man in the citizen. Not exactly a Republican sentiment. In the free cities of antiquity, Brownson pointed out, there were rights of the citizen, but no rights of men. Thus Socrates, condemned to death, submitted to the polis instead of heeding his friends' advice to flee. He had no rights as a man that he might plead. In Greece and Rome, there was no personal liberty. The individual counted for nothing. This subordination of the man to the citizen found its modern application in the dogma of the people as an absolute sovereign, which Brownson consistently opposed. He believed that the inalienable rights of men limited the powers of the state, whether it was controlled by monarchs or mobs. This idea played no part in the civic tradition. Those who wanted to find its antecedents, Brownson said, would have to look for the feudal system and still more to Christianity, which introduced the element of individuality. In his later phase, Brownson sometimes referred to himself as a Republican, but only to remind his readers, just as Paine had reminded his, that the term's literal meaning referred to the public good, or else to argue that the American people committed a serious mistake in translating republicanism into democracy, and should now restore. So it was a serious mistake, he's saying, in translating republicanism into democracy, and should now restore the government to the true principles of the Constitution. When Brownson invoked Harrington, it was only to disavow the impact of Harrington's work on his own views concerning the influence of property on politics and legislation. We may dismiss his claim that these views were original with me, but wherever he got them, his general point of view clearly owed more to Christian influences, overlaid at times with influences deriving from the Enlightenment, than to the tradition of civic humanism. His Christian radicalism, nevertheless, had certain points of contact with the Republican tradition, a taste for verbal combat, a confidence in the educative, character-forming discipline of political life, and the clash of opinions, a belief that man has an end, namely, to develop his capacities to the utmost, a suspicion that life was not worth living unless it was lived with ardour, energy, and devotion. Nothing is more nauseating than to be lukewarm, he held. Give us, we say, open, energetic, uncompromising enemies, or firm, staunch friends who will take their stand for the truth, to live with it or die with it, and not your half and half men. To live or die for truth was not the same thing, to be sure, as living for glory, but these ideals had more in common than either had. Say, with Paine's ideal of peace and safety, let alone a more fully developed liberalism of the kind articulated by Adam Smith. Brownson thought politics ought to address moral issues of transcendent importance, even at the risk of disturbing the peace. For this reason, he disassociated himself more than once from Paine's dictum that government was at best a necessary evil. His opposition to an educational establishment likewise sprang from considerations not unlike those that underlay Republican opposition to a standing army. Brownson argued, in effect, that the people would lose the capacity to educate themselves and their children if they turned education over to a class of professional custodians. Like Republicans, he opposed the whole trend toward a more and more highly specialized. Like Republicans, he opposed the whole trend toward a more and more highly specialized division of labour. This was his basic quarrel with the political economy of liberalism, as it was theirs. In 1841, still contending that the mission of this country was to raise up the labouring classes and make every man really free and independent. He regretted the division of society into working men and idlers, employers and operatives, a learned class and an unlearned, a cultivated class and an uncultivated, a refined class and a vulgar. The only way to reverse this trend, in his view, was to make. Sorry, I'll just go back over that. A refined class and a vulgar. The only way to reverse this trend, in his view, was to make every man a proprietor. This was the upshot of his famous essay in 1840, The Labouring Classes, a piece so radical that it was received, as Brownson later recalled, with one universal scream of horror. With good reason. Commentators have seen in the labouring classes anticipations of the Communist Manifesto launched upon the world 8 years later. All over the world, this fact stares us in the face. The working man is poor and depressed, while a large portion of the non-working men are wealthy. The evil, according to Brownson, did not lie in an excess of government, as Adam Smith's disciples believed, but in the present system of trade, specifically in wage labour. A cunning device of the devil. The real enemy of the working class was the middle class, always a firm champion of equality when it concerns humbling a class above it, but its inveterate foe when it concerns elevating a class below it. Having defeated the aristocracy, the middle class had turned conservative, whether it call itself Whig or Radical. The coming contest, already taking shape in England with the rise of the Chartist movement, would pit the working man against his employer, his only real enemy. It would not be resolved without war and bloodshed. Education would do little to improve the lot of the poor. Neither did the answer lie in self-culture, the favourite remedy of those who sought reform without disturbing the social arrangements which render reform necessary. Since the evil was inherent in all our social arrangements, it could not be cured without a radical change of those arrangements. The cure Brownson had in mind, of course, was proprietorship, not communism. There must be no class of our fellow men doomed to toil through life as mere workmen at wages. If wages are tolerated, it must be in the case of the individual operative, only under such conditions that by the time he is a proper age to settle in life, he shall have accumulated enough to be an only under such conditions that by the time he is of a proper age to settle in life, he shall have accumulated enough to be an independent labourer on his own capital, on his own farm, or in his own shop. Here is our work. Elsewhere, Brownson made himself even plainer. In The Convert, an autobiography published 17 years later, he explained that he had intended to abolish the distinction between capitalists and labourers, the factory system, the banking and credit system. The whole structure of modern progress. In short, I wish to check commerce, to destroy speculation, and for the factory system, which we are enacting tariffs to protect and build up, to restore the old system of real home industry. This was the political economy of republicanism, whether or not Brownson drew it from Republican sources. It had very little in common either with liberalism or with socialism. Democracy, as Brownson understood it, was incompatible with forward-looking programs of this kind. It left little room for improvement. It presupposed a simple market society and simple kind of liberty of which Carlyle speaks, to buy where we can cheapest, to sell where dearest. It presupposed the abolition of the paper money system, although men on the stock exchange will no doubt smile at our simplicity. Brownson admitted, in demanding a purely metallic currency, it presupposed economic independence. Any type of collectivism threatened it at its source. Independence did not imply solitude. If Brownson resisted a fuller development of the market, it was not because he feared that it would compromise his self-sufficiency. He was no Thoreau, opposed to improvement on the grounds that an elaboration of his wants beyond the level of subsistence would entangle him in a web of sociability. On the contrary, he valued sociability far more highly than most individualists, and he rejected the culture of philanthropy and improvement precisely on the grounds that it would replace the fellowship of friends and neighbours with the vague and watery fellowship of human. I'll just read that again. On the contrary, he valued sociability far more highly than most individualists, and he rejected the culture of philanthropy and improvement precisely on the grounds that it would replace the fellowship of friends and neighbours with the vague and watery fellowship of humanity in general. Your men, from whom all traces of their native land are obliterated, who have that enlarged philanthropy which overlaps all geographical distinctions and grasps with equal affection all lands, races, and individuals, are quite too refined and transcendental for daily use. Cosmopolitanism represented a higher form of solitude, as Brownian saw it. In developing this argument, he rested his case, as always, on assertions about the nature and destiny of man, that is, about the ends proper to his existence. The nature of man is to live by means of an uninterrupted communion with other men and with nature under the three precise and definite forms of family, country, and property. His destiny, that is, the design of his Creator in his constitution, is not then to place himself physically, sentimentally. I'll just read that again. His destiny, that is, the design of his Creator in his constitution, is not then to place himself sentimentally and intellectually in communion with all men and with all the beings of the universe. This were to annihilate him by the vast solitude of Sahara. Brownson made these observations in the course of one of his many attacks on the no government philosophy advocated by so many getting interesting. I'll just read that again. It's pretty interesting. Pretty particular little thing here. Brownson made these observations in the course of one of his many attacks on the non-government philosophy advocated by so many individualists. Paine's cosmopolitan humanitarianism and Thoreau's misanthropy both sprang from the fallacy that man could outgrow the need for government, that is, for active intercourse with those to whom he was bound by local attachments, a preference for his own natal soil, and the peculiar circumstances in which he was raised. Ideologies of self-sufficiency and ideologies of self-annihilation, in which the man was lost in the citizen, in Paine's case, in the citizen of the world, came to the same thing. Both undermined the condescended form of solidarity, the love of family and fatherland that human nature required if it was to flourish. Both made excessive demands on human nature, overlooking the crucial fact that the finite seeks in vain to master the infinite. The idea conveyed by this last phrase ties together the several themes in Brownson's social thought: the inseparability of matter and spirit, politics and religion, the formative discipline of peculiar circumstances as the necessary background of mature personality. I'll just read that again. The idea conveyed by this last phrase ties together the several themes in Brownson's social thought: the inseparability of matter and spirit, politics and religion, the formative discipline of peculiar circumstances as the necessary background of mature personality, the need for any vivid, I use that word, inseparability of matter and spirit, politics and religion, the formative discipline of peculiar circumstances as the necessary background of mature personality, the need for any vivid apprehension of reality, to be embodied in a particular and inevitably diverse set of loyalties rather than a watery eclecticism. Brownson never forgot that human beings have bodies and that man, disembodied, divested of the weight of circumstances and associations, would be no more a man than the body is a man when deprived of the spirit. Man grasps the universal only through the particular. This was the core of Brownson's Christian radicalism. For this reason, Brownson opposed any theory of progress that implied a rejection of the past. Having sided in his early writings with efforts for progress, he proceeded to take his readers aback by telling them that they must not run away from the past. The future could no more be disassociated from the past than the spirit could be disassociated from the body. There is no foundation for the distinction between the movement party and the stationary party, he argued. When one looks a little below the surface, thus the point of his important essay, Reform and Conservatism, 1842, was to dissolve the distinction invoked by the title. It is idle to war against the past. No man can be a reformer who has no tradition. Divest us of all tradition, of all that we have derived from the past, and we were mere naked savages. Brownson's unwillingness to choose between reform and conservatism, or to equate political radicalism with a repudiation of the past, was typical of the populist tradition. Wow. So I hope you found that interesting.